A very good afternoon to all of you. I thank you all for inviting me to the philosophy department. This is the first time I'm here as a speaker, and I've been here many times in the past when Professor Kulkarni used to invite us for various events, and very sadly the last time for his condolence meeting. So it's a kind of nostalgia to come here, but it's really nice to be here to talk about one of the topics that's very, very dear to me, and that is feminist epistemology. I have one more here. Am I audible? Yeah. Okay. Yeah. And it is something that I've been talking about, giving several lectures, mainly methodological, but I think today I'm going to be really looking at, I think we've gone too far in the slides.
No,
Yeah. So, next one, please. Yeah, so what I'm going to do today is kind of run you through the relationship between knowledge making in the feminist world and in the sociological world. And I would do that by drawing on my own research as much as I can, but also trying to look at the intersections, the trajectories that happen. So I know that most of the audience here is philosophy and political science and others, but there are also sociologists here. So but then the mandate has been also to talk about knowledge in the discipline that we come from. And that's what I'm happy about, to do over here. So the ways in which gender concerns are incorporated and mainstreamed in sociology have been critical to the evolution of the discipline in the past couple of decades. Even as there are discernible efforts to appear gender sensitive, much work in the field still kind of falls short of integrating gender into its larger agenda in a very meaningful way. But in this talk, I will discuss how the feminist perspective is not only possible, but necessary and central in all social research. It is problematic that sometimes we claim to be reflexive while turning the lens on the other, but falls short of questioning our own social locations. I will draw over my own research over the last 3 decades, primarily in the area of migration, diaspora, and gender, to establish the evolution of feminist epistemologies. So, if the sociological method has given the analytical rigor to feminist work, it is the feminist perspective that has completely transformed sociological understanding. Research on women's issues as they begin gradually evolved into research that problematized gender, allowing for a more nuanced understanding of a systematic marginalization through forces of domination such as patriarchy, colonialism, casteism, and racism. So if you look at this slide, what is it really? What is the knowledge? What is evolving? It is, again, a systematic critique of androcentrism. An integral part of the women's movements in different parts of the world have been to engage with this critique of androcentrism, which is really patriarchy in academic world. In India, historically, women's movements that protested violence against women in the form of dowry harassment or domestic violence converged with a conscious transformation of academic disciplines such as sociology and political science. These disciplines have a history of engagement with women's studies, especially in the transformation of the sub-disciplines of, say, family and kinship or work and labor. Now, what is actually happening when we talk about knowledge emerging? When you talk about, traditionally, there was a book written in 1987 called Women's Ways of Knowing. And when you talk about women's ways of knowing in that sense, are we really talking about a knowledge system that precludes, men and other genders? Well, we'll get into that a little later, but at that point of time, and I think it's important to contextualize where we are coming from. At that point of time, it was not imperative to worry about people who had the voice, but to look at those that did not. So, women's ways of knowing, quote unquote, and problematic, and why it became problematic later, we'll come to later, is because we are focusing on silence. And silence is very complex. Silence because you don't get a mic, you don't get heard, and you don't get visible. So, what gets, categorized as trivial? Whatever that the dominant ideology that is made by, in this case, a few white men, becomes the primary central knowledge system. So how does one look at the evolution of this knowledge system? And from our perspective, that is when I say our in this case, I mean sociological perspective, we're literally leaving out half the population or more, so is that even accurate? And of course, it's not even half, but if I take only gender, then that whole thing becomes interesting. And what becomes important and what becomes trivial? So, standing at a chai bandi and discussing the state of the world is important. But women gossip. Men were standing on the chat bandi, but women gossip. And what do women gossip about? How do we put the next meal on the table? Where do we find the extra money for the surgery that the drunk husband needs because he fell off? Something that is gossip, quote unquote. So who renders what important? Who renders ways of knowing and what gets rendered? This is fascinating actually, when you go and see and pick, it's an emerging, kind of ethos that you're looking at them in very, very different ways. So are there really ways of knowing? So feminist researchers have argued that social science theories traditionally have marginalized or rendered insignificant women's participation. In the rare cases of inclusion, these experiences have been highly distorted and presented in, androcentric terms, misogynist terms. Feminist scholars argued that mainstream social science tended to incorporate gender later on or earlier and in a problematical way, sex as only one of the many sociological variables under study. By doing that, gender becomes a mere referential point without assuming centrality. All social science research can be feminist, and I really believe that, without compromising on the strength of the discipline. And this perspective accounts adequately for the complex marginalities that are the stuff of sociological research, thereby adding to what we are very, very concerned about in our discipline, that is the reliability and the validity of the data. That is something that we obsess about literally. So feminist sociology insists on a central analytic category of gender without key concerns in the discipline, such as work, politics, education. So how do we look at this satisfactorily. Clues to unraveling this relationship between feminism and sociology can be found in the sociology of knowledge, and I like to use Sandra Harding's very familiar by now, move on, and the typologies that she delineates, the plurality of perspectives, that is feminist empiricism, standpoint feminism, postmodern or intersectionality. And I'll go slower later, but I just wanted to put that in front of you so that we kind of see how things have actually unfolded. Feminist empiricism identifies sexism or androcentrism as social bias which needs to be corrected. So we are still coming on the correction agenda out here. And the stricter adherence to the rules of scientific inquiry. It has primarily been used by researchers in biology and the social sciences. Harding points out that feminist empiricists work from the basic principle that both sexes have contributed to the evolution of our species, so there is a call for inclusion of women as both the researched and the researcher. So here is another point that one needs to, underline, and that is theory, method, and movement or praxis or what is actually going on out there are rather inseparable. How do you do something which is action without analytically thinking about it? So literally walk the talk in that sense, but also not just the talk and the theorizing, but look at what is on the ground and how do we pull what is on the ground into the center. So, and here I think at that point of time, when I'm saying that point of time, we're talking about the 1970s and the 80s, where it was a time when one was definitely talking about the civil rights movement, equality, and in the Indian context, the 1970s was a time when, left-oriented activist issues that involved gender came to the fore, and eventually the laws also emerged, that is the laws against rape and the laws against dowry. So what I'm talking about is the consciousness raising, the problems on the street could not be separated. They were all together. And in the Western context, when you talk about the civil rights movement, you're talking about racial discrimination and you're not talking about gender and what happens then. So yeah, what happens then, I'll say when I come to standpoint. But when you talk about adding women to the existing research agendas and giving them recognition in their respectable fields, we're talking about challenging the incompleteness of so-called scientific methods. And mine is a discipline that has been obsessively talking about how we should be a science, So that is how we emerged in that sense. Is that a social fact? Can I prove it? So then we kind of wanted to also wonder where this was going. So this was completely necessary at a time when little or no research was done on women, and empiricists challenged the incompleteness but continued somehow to employ the same methods for greater objectivity. And inclusion happened. And I'm not trying to discount that inclusion. And so the other way of calling feminist empiricism, which you see in many texts, is actually adding women. So how in the previous slide it was, how do you make the invisible visible? And in this time we are saying, how do you add? Why do you need to add? I don't need to probably tell you, but because that adding was going on. And this perspective was a little critical of the dominant mode for neglecting gender and bias. And this adding led to surveys that sought to correct male bias by first including sex until the 70s. Then slowly by the end of the 80s, gender became a variable. And you also have to think that Gender is a word that is being used primarily or only in the English language. I don't think any of our Indian languages has a separate word for sex and gender. So there is also a very conscious, and now when we're talking about the, the whole spectrum of gender, and we're not looking at it as a binary, it becomes more useful to understand. So this adding led to surveys. For instance, in our studies of intergenerational mobility, it was so easily done to just do father to son, and this is inaccurate. A father may be a carpenter, a son may be a doctor, but the fact that the mother was a teacher was never part of the method. And it's everything that the mother was a teacher that led to the son becoming whatever he was, or the daughter becoming whatever she was. And so it was, we did famous studies, as MA students, we would look at Blau and Duncan social stratification, but nobody looked at impaired methodology. There is absolutely no. So then what is that? The teacher is an extension of the mother, which is an extension of nothingness. We don't see it. What do you do? Nothing. So if the care occupations, such as teaching, especially primary school, are considered to be very, very similar to actually something that happens at home, what is that happens at home? Oh, nothing. So that nothingness is what constituted the knowledge or the lack of it, the knowing. So this work, okay, stratification I said, and then however, this kind of work only resulted in correcting facts rather than providing a deeper understanding. And of why was there so much inequality of gender existing? So theory and subsequently research from the standpoint perspective made an effort to understand gender equality. So what was this standpoint? So here there was a phase when one was building that epistemology is gendered. There are women's ways of knowing, and knowledge needs to be understood from various standpoints. Now, if you look at it, whether it's subaltern studies, intersectionality, everything that emerged from this perspective. Whatever we are talking about today as the knowers and the known, and who are the knowers that are being neglected and are left out of the spectrum, it started with, the recognition that women themselves are being left out. I think it was a very kind of interesting situation. And in India, actually, before I get into more examples of standpoint theory, we had in 1974 Veena Mazumdar's Committee on the Status of Women, which was set up to understand women's status in education, health and other parameters. At that point of time, this was absolutely necessary. Equality was not only an ideological force, but a goal that could be achieved only by understanding what are these dominant reasons for exclusion. And feminist scholars began to strongly state that if you look at gender as a variable, and I'm sorry that a lot of even contemporary research does that. Yes, ma'am, I've added gender as a variable. And then what happens after that? At the end of it, it's there, because your guilt conscience, yes, I've taken this, it's politically correct, it's there, but you just forget about it at the end of it all. And then there's a skewed study again that emerges. And this, I think, is absolutely something that research scholars especially should think of at every given, what should I say, stage of their knowledge gathering. These interventions are built, always, we're building the foundations for research from a standpoint perspective. And this report, Mazumdar's report, was absolutely essential for us to make sense of how bad things were. Things are really bad. Let me take only one example, and that is education, and say that every time I'm doing a kind of history of women's movements in India or something like that, from, I'm a sociologist and I hope there are not too many historians here, because I'm just going to jump centuries without worrying about it, and it's a historian's nightmare when you do that. But we have a privilege of doing it and I'll use it. So there is the fact that since from the 1800s to the 21st century, there is one thing that keeps coming back in the gender gap, and that is education. There is the girl-child dropout rate. And why is there a girl-child dropout rate? Is it the state? Is it the way that the schools are conceptualized? And then ultimately somebody will say, no, it's the family, it's the culture that they won't want to send their kids to school post-puberty. That's a lot of nonsense, because I think what is actually, there are some seats in front if you want to come. So what is actually important is that we come into a situation wherein the way you conceptualize gender inequality in schools is absolutely necessary. As a researcher, I need to observe that what is wrong. What is wrong? Maybe the bus is too far away, and so there may be a sexual assault on the way, and the parents and the children are afraid of that. Maybe there are no toilets in school, mundane things. But these are realities that you need to understand about why there is that gender gap. And I'm only talking about school dropout rate. I'm not even going into higher education. So in that sense, how do you understand gender and education? I think this is something that needs to be definitely more than a variable. How many students are female in the University of Hyderabad is only a starting point, and then what happens after that, it's a huge complexity. So feminist standpoint theory attempts to work through the struggles of women to provide a less biased, less defensive, less perverse, and most of all, a more equal understanding of human relations. Standpoint feminists argue that the theoretical perspective offered by them and the methods they use to analyze society are from the perspective of the subjugated gender. And there are different, they are different from the empiricist thing, because for them, where is the knowledge grounded? Knowledge is grounded in experiential reality. That is the first lesson in how we do research. How do you understand experiences? Why is it important to understand experiences? First of all, we need to listen. And that listening, as researchers, we are not there to, go and give our gyan. We are there to learn, to listen. And that is amazing. Once you learn, you have to listen, and the knowledge is coming from somewhere. It's an absolutely wonderful kind of seeking of what to do and how to do, that it's different. So, there are the standpoint perspective dominated the gender-centric sociology for the end of the 20th century for a couple of decades. Intersectionality was coming in, but without leaving the centrality of this. A sociology for women preserves the presence of subjects as knowers and as actors. It does not transform subjects into objects of study or make use of conceptual devices for eliminating the active presence of subjects. Its methods and analytic procedures seek to preserve the presence of the active and experiencing subject. The standpoint perspective enables the researcher to get off his high horse. Get off that positivist high horse. Who are we? We are nobodies when we get in there. So everything needs to change. Our body language, our approach. We need to start respecting the people that we would like to get our data from, and talk about it. So, the hierarchical approach with the researcher transmitting knowledge to his respondents in a rather Orientalist fashion needed to go. That was something that was central. Women respondents needed to be seen not as objects of positivist inquiry, but as partners in the research process. Idealistic, yes, but imperative. Because one needs to listen, one needs to talk about it, and you can't say, what does water rights have to do with Dalit women? Everything. If you're doing a study on water rights and you're not talking about caste and gender, then where is your knowledge? It's seeking, it's skewed. So that, I think, is something that one needs to look at. So the approach is, yes, conscious partiality rather than, value neutrality. And Dorothy Smith, one of the early standpoint feminist scholars, sociologists, said she had two theoretical approaches that a lot of feminists borrow from, and one is, of course, the Marxist vision, where science can reflect upon the way the world is and work toward emancipation. But even in mainstream Marxism, women never seem to be part of, even the proletariat in any explicit manner. Women's emotional, quote unquote, or reproductive labor was rendered invisible as they were roles as social agents, but not as knowledge producers. So people made this kind of distinction between agential and producing knowledge, and that was again artificial. But the turning point in standpoint feminism happened when you see women as the agents of knowledge themselves, and the experiences become resources for social analysis, and it is women who are able to reveal what women's experiences really are. In the 1970s and 80s, men were doing gender studies very, very marginally. It was not that common. And slowly it was, one sees, it's become heartening that in the contemporary world, one has looked at things that are very, very different. Like Sanjay Srivastava was talking about, how masculinity became a center of gender studies only in the 21st century. But yes, it at least became, and studies of masculinity were quite crucial. So, the subjugated gender cannot be seen as part of a binary opposition with the other gender, but it should be seen, as Smith insists, within the relations of ruling of particular contexts. And this concept focuses our attention on the forms of knowledge, which are, social institutions and practices. So when you look at it, for instance, within the economic institutions, there was a constant devaluation of women's work, which came from invisibilizing it. So this is what I was saying a little earlier. What are you doing? And your grandmother says nothing, and you take that nothing as real knowledge. But feminist knowledge will go and debunk that nothing and tell us that what that nothing is, real. Okay, you didn't do anything, but what is it that you've been doing since morning? So how do you actually look at that? That's at home. But even in the so-called separation, no, it's not yet separation, but so-called public sphere, you have this kind of, when women are here, why are they invading our space? So it's a very beautiful film that many of you would have seen, a documentary film by Paromita Vora called Q to P. And it is something that looks at our cities and its public planning at spaces as absolutely male spaces. When women are there, there are no toilets in the public. And these are two big cities, Mumbai and Delhi, that she does her work in, and this is, almost 20 years old now, I think, that film. But still, I think it's a fascinating way to understand the artificial separation of the public and the private, and, how young women wake up at 4 a.m. and wake up a couple of cousins or friends to come and stand outside the public bathrooms before they finish their morning rituals, that they need to get out for, because later there's too much ogling, and say it's sexual harassment. For God's sake, not Eve teasing, but we still continue to use that word. But yes, there is that kind of sexual harassment that goes on. And where are we at that particular point? How do you, so Paramita actually looks at that space as a very, very interesting space. So who is queuing up to pee and where, that's the basic question that is there. So, the standpoint argument is also that there is a way in which women are otherized by mainstream society and patriarchy. It can't be just by men, but by men and patriarchy, which includes women who are practicing patriarchy as well. That's a very important thing. So there are standpoints of women that are specific to specific contexts and experiences. And yeah, we can move on. So in many of these cases, we are talking about differences along the lines of race, caste, class, religion, region. Women might have similarities with men in their social locations, not with women. So we cannot essentialize gender. And that's that move that they made from standpoint feminism to postmodern feminism. That is where we go. And scholars such as Chandra Mahanti argued for alliances to be forged between women of color. Universal sisterhood became a theme that had informed an empiricist phase. So, the books with titles like Sisterhood is, global, sisterhood is something else, common. All these things are, not acceptable, because while someone is fighting about the glass ceiling in a multinational corporate, the other one is fighting for water rights. So who has that common with whom? So forging alliances have to be across, groups. Sociality is constructed in a very, very different way. So the enquiry, the feminist enquiry, especially in the Indian context, moved very, very soon into what we call today as the intersectional perspective. But I think I want to pay some respect to Pat Hill Collins for privileging, the fact that the standpoint is not a singular. So she says, yes, black feminist sociologist, for those of you who don't know the name, Patricia Hill Collins, and she drew our attention to marginalities of both race and class, but very, very influenced by standpoint as well. So feminist scholars around the world really said we have to look at marginalities that were based on race, class, intersectionalities. So if you look at, say, male child preference, where does that come from? You can't have a middle class educated respondent telling you it doesn't matter, I'm pregnant, and it doesn't matter who I give birth to. And you cannot go back and say that we don't care for male child preference at all. But on the other hand, if you also talk to somebody, and I'm again stereotyping, but probably in maybe northwestern India, and say that, they are going for sex selective abortion to a quack because they've already have two daughters and they just cannot afford a third. So is that the norm? Is this the norm? So I can't generalize about that. But you have to, so it's intersectionality that tells you that patriarchy operates in different ways, in different forms. As Bina Agarwal said, I think it's very, very important to understand what is property, who owns property. But property also is classist. So, if you're talking about property, how do you talk about property without talking about the economic kind of issue? So it's fascinating to see where we are going with that. There's also a very, very interesting example, which is very well known, and I think it is one of the single most, what should I say, it's one of the best examples of standpoint feminism in India, and that is Urvashi Bhutalia's Other Side of Silence, because Bhutalia is rewriting partition history by listening to women who were probably violated, assaulted, and many other things. And what is the trauma? What is the trauma that they experienced? So when she did this in the late 80s, a lot of people said, why are you digging up? But why are you only getting some versions of partition? Why aren't you getting the other versions? Why is the gender subtext, not even a subtext? So that was essential. And then it was, when she talked about it, when she came to Hyderabad, she came here also to the university, she was saying that they also established Kali for women, and then later, of course, Zuban. It was very, very necessary to establish Kali for women, she said. She said, I am not ashamed of saying that you need to publish women's writing because others don't want to publish it. And later, it's probably more prestigious to publish with Kali than some of the other so-called mainstream presses. That's what happened. And that's commendable to see how things actually moved. So, stories of partition reveal the violence against the nation state is also violence on the bodies of women, in effect making them custodians of the nation state. So it was conceived in a very layered fashion. So there are several narratives of sexual violence going hand in hand with what is called ethnic cleansing. Next slide. So I'd also like to, look at, say, since we have people from different disciplines, I'll spend a couple of minutes on women writing in India, because I had not had this included in another lecture and suddenly realized that people are not so familiar with it. It's already 30 years old. And Susie Taru and K. Lalita's, phenomenal volume, Women Writing in India. How many of you have actually come across it? Yeah, so that's what I meant. So here there was the uncovering of writing in several Indian languages from late 18th century, mostly 19th century. And Susie and Lalita actually wrote the introduction for this. Again, it came out with, the Indian version came out with Kali. Because of Kali, I brought this up. And it also came with the Feminist Press in New York. But I'm also mentioning publishers for a reason. Because I think when you are uncovering ways of knowing and knowledge, you need to see who is reading this, but you also need to see whether people are, actually trying to read and trying to talk about in a particular way. So, there was a massive exercise to unearth poetry, fiction, drama, autobiographies written by women in 11 different languages spanning 2000 years and offer them to readers in English. Now, if I speak in Telugu, most of you would be out of the room. So, yeah, this is a post-colonial condition wherein we required that. So, this translation into English made us aware of writing originally in Assamese or in Oriya or in Malayalam, and then come to it. The other thing is, and one of the women who got translated into this, into English, was telling us, I happen to know her, she said, finally, somebody apart from my extended family is going to read what I write. You know, otherwise it's just that, this auntie also writes well. You know, she cooks well, but she also writes well. So it's just one of her little things. But, you know, how do you project it? You know, what is that conditioning that happens with us not to give importance to the knowledge that is produced at a particular point of time? So, so this opened the path for the inclusion of voices that were otherwise neglected, but also bring to light this thing. Now, in Sharmila Rege's work, we see a lot of, you know, the personal is the political, because Dalit women struggles, writing caste, writing gender, for instance, the book that we read in my PhD class is of what she calls testimonies, you know, of 8 Dalit women. And these again have been translated into English, but for Rege, it's not just the publication, but her classroom was her political space, and her texts were literally her weapons of the weak. Her critical and in-depth analysis shows that caste and gender, and class of course, cannot be privileged one over the other. And this is a very important point. Is it caste that's more important? Is it gender that's more important? Is it class that's more important? No, I don't think we need to ask one to privilege one over the other, but it's something that goes, you know, absolutely together, and there should not be any fuzziness in our minds, even in living and experiencing, than it is. So, this work actually rigorously interrogated many questions, such as what are those political realities and the power dynamics that operate in the home as well as in the workplace. So, these methods are also reflected in her colleague and friend Gopal Guru's writing along with Sundar Sarukkai on experience and theory in social scientific inquiry. So what I'm trying to say is the kinds of politics of location that Sarukkai and Guru debate about is something which is very, very familiar in the epistemology of gender. You know, that has already been, it's a kind of, you know, yeah, of course they do refer to it, but not in a central way. You know, so this, and of course, when reference happens also, not here it's not Guru and Sarukkai, but many others, it would be to can the subaltern speak and Spivak in a different light. But it's also very interesting to see who we want to talk about. See, what I'm saying is also, yeah, it's a bit problematic probably, but it's fine, I will say it, but sounding complex, complicating what you need to actually say was necessary to legitimize social science. Feminist epistemologies questioned that. And I think we don't apologize for it. So we don't need to apologize for it at all. That is something which is very heartening actually. You know, you say what you have to say, you say your questions, when you ask your questions, I don't know about philosophy, but in our disciplines, you know, we need to have clarity. And that clarity comes from questioning the ambiguous. And I think that ambiguity sometimes is rather deliberate. So that, yeah, gender is important. You can't accuse me of being sexist. So that's what you hear, you know. But then where is it? I have to search for it. You know, even your work, in your writing, when you talk about film, you know, you talk about stars, you talk about something else. And where is gender? Do I have to really take a magnifying glass to look for it? Isn't it not staring it in the face? So these are things that bother us. So, yeah, I've just put some challenges up there. And these challenges are also, not very real in one sense. And when, during the course of my own, I'm not, sorry, what did I say? They are real, but they are not very clear in that sense sometimes. Say, for instance, when there is something going on for equal pay for equal work, oh, that is a problem that we don't have. We may not have it in the way that it's articulated in another place, but we do have it in ways, especially corporate organizations are very, very clever about wage discrimination in gender without coming out openly about it. Public institutions are much better. It's not, but I'm saying there are ways and ways and ways to do it and say, okay, just like the glass ceiling, a similar kind of vein that goes on. Next slide, please. So how do we actually go about doing this? And then Rege did it through oral histories and life histories. Mary John and Ravinder Kaur did it through interviews. So we have different kinds of ways of doing this research. And how do we listen? What do we do? So when we are coming in to the third perspective, moving from standpoint, it started off as feminist postmodernism in the late 80s and then to intersectionality. Chandra Mohanty, Patricia Hill Collins, Sharmila Rege, and of course Kimberly Crenshaw can be seen as the pioneers of the methodology of inclusion of the hitherto excluded categories among women. So postmodernism goes farther than standpoint feminism in tackling questions of difference. And when we talk about this, there is the existence, nature and powers of reason, progress, science, language and the subject self. And it is suggested that multiple differences can be taken into account in theorizing, and something that I just said a little earlier, without privileging gender or caste one over the other. But one of the problems that emerges is there an endless difference? And there is the question asked by Di Stefano and others. And Spivak said that when we talk about subaltern articulations, again, how do we look at it? So in her many translations of Mahashweta Devi's stories, I think you can see what she tries to uncover. That's one of the things that happens over there. And in the Indian context, the 1990s and the early 21st century was a period when the caste lens, post-Mandal, became the most important axis for empirical investigation. Gender was taken for granted or subsumed, even in politically engaged scholarship. And this is what Janaki Nair said after the Nirbhaya case. And she was saying, where she wrote in the Hindu, I think, one piece where she was talking about, where is the women's movement? Where has it gone? And then looking back at this. So the intersectional approach combined the multiple standpoint perspective. And when, in my own work, when I bring in migration diaspora, I'd like to use again Tejaswini Niranjana's landmark documentation of the subaltern diaspora, when she looks at the role played by women in the early 20th century campaign against the indentured servitude. And Niranjana talks about India's disavowal of the indentured woman in Trinidad, and when she was actually moved as looked at as a morally depraved person, and why do we really talk about it? So the colonial struggle, you don't really talk about her. So the plantation worker also remains male. That lens does not change. So the experience of women being exploited both economically and sexually on the colonial plantations presents an entirely new angle. So when I look at migration and diaspora, I began with the category of the immigrant woman, And the immigrant woman also was always seen as a dependent migrant, not as a migrant in her own right. When you look at the nannies, the maids, the sex workers who are going on their own visas, or the nannies and maids who are forced into sexual labor at a particular point of time, they are the main migrants. They are not dependent. In fact, their families are dependent on them. They have children, they have parents, and sometimes husbands that they have to feed, with being the single earners. And that is something that's very, very important. So from looking at, these kinds of stories of labor, of migration, or of, when we now talk about return migrants and we talk about what they're actually doing, people are actually writing, about their experiences of return. They're writing blogs, they're writing things. So we do textual analysis of that. And how do you uncover material which is actually new ways of knowing? So if you need to understand feminist epistemology today, I think the cyberspace is a huge world, because everyone writes there. Everyone writes there. Is it an equalizer or a divider? Is something that we need to research. But gender is very, very present in that. And you know that as better than me as well. So Kalpana Kannabiran brings together, for instance, women's perspectives on law with a focus on women's rights in legal, social and economic institutions, and she uses the case studies that, of people who have gone to lawyers to do that. And here I think it's crucial for us to understand the power struggles that emerge between caste, gender and community. These trajectories of migration, I think, is very, very interesting when, another example I'll give you is in the American context. Margaret Abraham, her work on looking at women's organizations in New York City that were helping abused, battered South Asian women. And she did this, a number of South Asian women's resource centers had sprung up in different cities, and domestic violence is one of the most glaring problems. But the problem here is, in the immigrant context, some of these women were not comfortable with so-called, the culture and the language of the battered women's shelters that existed. And they needed that South Asian space with legal counseling and, most importantly, to let them retrieve their passports, because one of the things was the spouses would take away the passport. What are the different forms of violence? So taking away a passport in a situation where the woman has nowhere else to go, like she becomes a non-citizen in a space. And when does that really happen? So how do we look at that? Family violence in South Asian communities, such as the US, is a complicated phenomenon occurring at the interface of cultural conditioning, racial prejudice, isolation from home and community, and immigrant status. So there are many, many methods that one has used and one has seen feminist researchers use to understand these gendered realities. So the other question, you see, I think the last part of the 20th century, the 70s, the 80s, saw the emergence of cultural studies that you are familiar with in philosophy as well, gender studies and media studies, and the kind of interdisciplinarity that's there. And I think it has been very, very easy for gender studies to be welcoming of other disciplines, using it. It has never been hard. We have never been dismissive of interdisciplinarity, and we move between disciplines quite easily. It's much more challenging. I think it even went off the slide when I was adding something. The sciences were also there. And, it's like, for instance, in the 80s, what do you when you talk about women's ways of knowledge? Medical researchers looking at breast cancer. It became a big thing in the 80s. So are we saying there was no breast cancer before the 1980s? But it was never part of their knowledge. You never did research on that, because the female body was seen as a reproductive body between the ages of whatever, 18 and 45 at that point of time. And everything of the body was associated to the reproductive organs. So everything else becomes cursory. Everything else becomes, okay, then you look at the woman's body as a space that needs other kinds of research. So you also needed a feminist lens to transform medical and scientific research. And of course, I can't get into Donna Haraway, but most of you are familiar that she has also revolutionized biological research by her, very, very interesting interventions. So interdisciplinarity, I'm not going to dwell on. I'm already almost out of time. And next slide. So how does one look at research or the endeavor of recovering knowledge as something which is, looking at bringing about change, striving for, like I said right in the beginning, that close parallel between theory, method, and movement. And contemporary research also looks at many, many things like that. Care, for instance, domestic labor. Now, these are central things. Now, you might say, what is this? What's so great about it? But when we first started looking at domestic labor, sociologists of labor did not want to recognize it, define it as labor. They said this is part of family studies. But Anne Oakley had to challenge that and say, no, I want to study domestic labor as labor. It was not easy in the 70s to do that. Now the care industry, how do you look at care? So when you look at men in care, you see that it's a feminization of labor that has happened. And if there is a male, ward, what we call in our Indian hospitals as the ward boy or the male nurse, there are two different categories, but I'm talking of gender, so I'm combining the two. When we talk about the ward boy or the male nurse, he will not get paid much more because caring is a feminized activity. So if a man is cooking at home, he doesn't get paid much. If a man is cooking at a restaurant, it's a male profession. It's a totally different category. So one needs to also look at the feminization of labor and the visibility that happens. So I think Sneha already spoke here, so I'm not going to dwell too much into law, because I think there is that whole feminist intervention. We have been, we have a fantastic track record of in the women's movement. We have had very, very engaged lawyers from the beginning to now, constantly introducing new laws, transforming them, fighting about the culture of the courtroom. So when you look at the courtroom, how does the courtroom look? In a country that does not want to talk about sexuality, you have to get this little girl to come and talk about penetration over there. How can she talk about it with all these, institutionalized patriarchy that's operating around her, with all the guys ogling in that sense? So how do you understand the culture of the courtroom? So that, I think, becomes a very interesting question for sociologists. And of course, integrating gender concerns into development discourse and practice. Kanchan is here, community media. I think looking centrally at gender, talking about the ways in which women's voices are bringing about change. These are the things that when one talks about, bringing in that interdisciplinary lens to look at social change. And I myself, of course, am a fan of ethnography, which has three goals: to document activities and lives of people, to understand and present experiences from their own viewpoints, whether it's women or other genders, and interpret their behavior as an expression of their social contexts. That becomes very, very important. So fieldwork that entails the active involvement of the researcher in the production of knowledge. Yes, as I said, idealistic, partners in the process, but what did we really mean? What does it translate? Go back and share if you can, talk about it. This is what you told me and this is what I'm writing. Do you actually agree with this? And if not, how do I change that? That becomes interesting. And the flexibility of using different methods and different researches, and I think the transformation of field sites itself. So yeah, that's the last slide, I think. So we have, again, let me reiterate the point that experiential analysis is absolutely important. And I was so upset in one of my, about 20 years ago when I first started teaching, and one of my students wrote experimental analysis. I said, was I so ineffective in the classroom? Because this whole enterprise is about experience, and how do we actually look at it? In what ways, whose experiences are we trying to record? Yeah, the merging of the public and the private, I think I spent enough time, and research as lived experience. So this, of course, everybody talks about it, post Guru and Sarukai, I think. But what lived experience means, you have to go back to feminist standpoints to look at where its antecedents are really, and from value neutrality to conscious partiality. So there's no problem, if I take a feminist perspective, so what? I wear it on my sleeve, it's good. There's nothing problematic about that. I don't have to push that under the carpet. And from the top down, if I know everything, why do I do research? Ma'am, this thing, they're like this, they're like that, I don't want to. So why are you going in there to study that? If you're the know-it-all, especially for us who do research with people, if you know everything, why are you even asking those questions? So I think you need to look at the who and listen to them a little more. Thank you very much. Thank you for giving me this opportunity.